Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. I am Katie Brewer and my guest today doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is one of the best lyricists of his or any generation and a primary member of one of my all-time favourite bands. As a hint, this band was supported by The Specials, R.E.M., The Jam, Dire Straits, U2, XTC and Paul Weller. They released 16 albums and have had numerous top 10 hits. Aside from being a lyricist, my guest is a guitarist, singer, songwriter, producer, and in addition to his work with his band, which I'll get to, was manager to Brian Ferry and the Stripes, has written songs for the likes of Jules Holland, Helen Shapiro, Billy Bremner and Elvis Costello, and has written lyrics for, among others, Jules, Elton John and Wet Wet Wet's Marty Pellow. He's an author, a podcaster of I Never Thought It Would Happen, with over 30 episodes to date, which he does to support the charity Help Musicians. He runs songwriting retreats. He's a mentor to recovering addicts. And when I read his autobiography, I realised I needed to add to his list of accolades, top bloke. I watched him at Glastonbury this year and my friends and I agreed that his set was the best hour of the festival. I knew every song word for word and have marvelled at his clever, witty lyrics for decades. His singles album was the first CD I ever bought and is probably the most played album I have. Of course, alternatively, I could just tell you that I have the honour of talking today to Chris Difford from Squeeze.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. So Chris, you're born in Greenwich, you born into a working class family, and in your autobiography you say, we had a green bath and matching basin, a tin bath for outside and a shed. Could you please give us a flavour of your home life?
Well, it was pretty simple, really. My dad was at work most of the time. He worked at the local gas board, the gasworks down in Greenwich. And my mum was pretty much at home. She did get a job a bit later on. She worked in the local police station, which was quite interesting. We had a simple world, as far as I can recall anyway.
And when did you discover your love of writing poetry?
When I was quite young, I suppose 13 or 14 years, I kind of couldn't concentrate on very much else. And I found that just writing stories, as stupid as they were in those days, was something that kept me quiet and kept me entertained. And I guess that's where my imagination was born from.
And did you have anyone who encouraged you?
No, nobody encouraged me. It was a battle of wits. Encouragement really didn't come until I met Glenn, I suppose, and we formed the band Squeeze, kind of encouragement that you get when you form a band from your brothers and from people around you. It's the sort of foundations of what you end up doing. So, yeah, the recognition, if you like, did come for quite some time.
And you had a phase where you were a skinhead. And how did you enjoy that?
I don't know if I enjoy is the word, being a skinhead. Being a skinhead was just something I had to do because I lived on a council estate and all the boys on the estate were skinheads. So it was kind of obvious I couldn't really do very much else. And I enjoyed it. I made some great friends. And I've just been thinking about them recently, what happened to them all, because I haven't seen them for hundreds of years. But I suspect most of them are in prison.
You leave school, and I think I'm right in saying that you went for careers advice, and you said you either wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force, a pig farmer, or a member of The Who. And, well, you kind of did one of those. And then you had a series of jobs. And amongst all of this was your burgeoning passion for music, for listening to it, for going to gigs. And was there anything that sort of was the catalyst for that?
Boredom was a catalyst because there was not much else to do. And the fact that music was really important as a young boy. I don't think it is so much these days to people growing up, but to have vinyl records in a record collection and a record player was gold dust. And it was the education that you needed. You needed to listen to the music, and it in turn gave you the love for what you needed to be doing. So whether I was listening to Rodgers and Hammerstein or David Bowie or Lou Reed, it didn't matter. It was all the education. And my lyrics kind of grew out of a fascination for that kind of songwriting. And the idea of being in a band always attracted me because it was almost like being in a gang, which is what I grew up being used to. And, you know, when I look at bands like the Foo Fighters, for instance, they still very much are a gang. And I think that's when a band is at its most healthiest, I think.
Yeah. I would recommend your book to all young musicians because you talk about the fact that it wasn't an instant success and you were very honest about those early days. I mean, you end up playing at Madison Square Garden, but you know, you had to go through that before you got there, which is very heartening for the others. And there was a fantastic line that you wrote. It was exciting to jump in the van and head off all over the country, playing to people who mostly didn't want to see us. And that's, you know, and that I have a daughter who's a singer-songwriter, and she plays with Zach Hobbs, in fact, your guitarist. And she has experienced a lot of that. And when she sort of can play to a number of people, and then she's actually just playing to her mum. And you all have to go through it.
Well, I still go through it. I mean, a lot of the time when I'm playing my solo shows, you know, you have to win the crowd over. And, you know, you have to tell them stories and make them feel welcome. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah, well, you certainly did do that in Glastonbury when I saw you.
Good.
And was it actually true that your keyboards player had to get into Glastonbury in the trunk of your car?
That's correct, yeah. He forgot his ticket.
Okay. Wow. Let's move on to 1973, and you meet Glenn Tilbrook. And I know you will have told this story many times, but could you talk about how you got to meet each other?
Quite simply, I put an advert in a sweet shop window for a guitarist to join a band, and Glenn was the only person who answered the ad, which is fortuitous because we've been together now for, I don't know how many years, 40 plus years. It's extraordinary, really, when you think about it, that you can put one advert in a sweet shop window and the rest of your life is mapped out by that. The fact that I'm sitting here today really wouldn't have happened if Glenn hadn't have answered that advert, and I'm very grateful for him.
And how did you take to each other initially?
I think we were kind of standoffish with each other, a bit shy maybe. I suppose within about 3 or 4 months, we discovered that our roles were me writing lyrics and him writing the music, because he had such a talent for that and his voice is so brilliant. So that sort of formed the rest of our career up until maybe 15 years ago, when it changed a little bit. You know, it's very comfortable beginnings, really, because Glenn just sings so beautifully, he writes beautiful melodies, and it all makes sense. So it made for an easy journey. And then with Jules Holland in the band, and pretty soon after Gilson Lavis on drums, it really made for the gang that I was dreaming of, really.
And how did you go from the gang to actually becoming Squeeze and taking off?
It didn't come quickly. It took a few years, and in fact it grew over maybe a 10-year period before we ended up playing Madison Square Garden, that kind of venue in America in particular. There was a lot of groundwork, and sometimes I look at it and I think that's extraordinary, the amount of work that we've done to get where we are. It's been quite a journey, a lot of heavy loading and a lot of misunderstandings, but also a lot of love, because that's what you ultimately need in a partnership.
Yeah. You have a whole bunch of different managers, and then you end up with Miles Copeland. For a while, you're writing songs, you're playing them, you're touring, but you have no idea whether it's going to work or not, or whether anyone's going to pay attention to you. Was there a particular moment when you suddenly thought, this really is working?
I was just sitting in the garden before we came on Zoom, and I was thinking, I'm still waiting for that moment to happen. It's extraordinary, really. I mean, the amount of success you could point towards what we've done, the journey that we've made. Yet I still feel the ultimate goal, whatever that goal is, hasn't been reached yet. And I think it's like the oscillation between people that doesn't allow that to happen. But maybe it's not meant to happen, and maybe that's why the reality is pronounced as it actually is.
Because to anyone else, it's a huge triumph, a huge success, some of my favourite songs of all time. And so what, in your mind, are you reaching for that you haven't had yet?
Well, I think it's the recognition in some ways, and the kind of belonging to part of the industry that I don't think we belong to. It's interesting and difficult to describe, because this is just from my point of view, but I think Squeeze is seen in a very charming way, kind of almost like a museum piece from many years ago. I don't think we're seen as writers of value beyond what we do within Squeeze. And I think we've not really had the opportunity all the time, possibly, to announce ourselves in a stronger place. And I'm not being down on what we've done. I think we've done an amazing job, but I just don't think we've reached the pinnacle of our success yet.
Well, going through those earlier stages, in 1977, you have John Cale from the Velvet Underground comes to listen to you, and he produces the EP Packet of Three. What happened when you first met him?
Well, he was somebody I grew up really admiring, and he was difficult to get on with at the beginning. In fact, he was just difficult to get on with. But, he ushered us into a studio, listened to our songs, and then promptly told us he didn't like any of them and got us to go and rewrite. So the first album was very much his inspiration. The second album, Call for Cats, was very much Squeeze's songs that we had already had in our back pocket in some ways. And we still have a back pocket full of songs, even now, from that period of time, which that have not seen the light of day yet.
Wow, because Call for Cats was really the album that really sort of cemented your place as one of Britain's most important young bands. And Call for Cats the single went to number 2, and Cowboys, Sweeney, Pub, Disco. What was the inspiration behind those lyrics?
I don't know. It was kind of Benny Hill springs to mind. His songs were sort of ridiculous and yet charming, at least in those days. And, each verse is about a different TV show. So that's kind of, I was in TV world then.
And then Up the Junction, that went to number 2. And then you guys are, at that point, on Top of the Pops, Kenny Everett Show, Jim Will Fix It.
Mm.
Can you sort of recall what your emotions were at that time? Because getting to Top of the Pops is a massive thing. I mean, for me, Top of the Pops as a teenager was my world. My week revolved around Thursday evening watching Top of the Pops. It was everything.
Well, it was for me too. So Thursday night watching Top of the Pops was everything. Yeah, definitely. My mum and dad would stop what they were doing to watch it. Everybody stopped to watch. So it was a great joy to be on it, and we were on it quite a few times over our career. It did the job, it got us in everybody's living room, and TV like that is what makes you famous. And of course today we don't have that, so young bands have to find other ways of getting themselves heard or seen. So it's a lot harder today than it was then.
And how about your parents? Because I guess they would have thought you're in a rock and roll band, this is going to go nowhere. And how was their reaction to it all?
They weren't very encouraging at the beginning, but then once they saw me on Top of the Pops, it all became amazing. It happened really quickly, going to America, touring constantly. It all happened, it seems like in one day, but it was over many years. But it just seems like one day of my life that all happened.
And then they keep coming, because you have then Argy Bargy comes out with Pulling Muscles from a Shell, and your album East Side Story, produced by Elvis Costello. Great title. Tempted is in the charts. Is That Love is in the charts. It's one of my favorite lyrics. My assets froze while yours have dropped. Label with Love goes to number 2. You lose Jules Holland and you gain Paul Carrick. And yeah, you're touring nonstop in the US, UK, everywhere. What would a day and evening in the life of Squeeze on tour look like?
Pretty much the same as any band. And it's still probably the same. You spend all day hanging about. And you do a sound check for half an hour, then you hang about a bit more. And then you get the green light to go on stage. You have fun for a couple of hours. And then you sort of just press play and repeat. And you're off again. And it sounds glorious, which it is, but it's also it takes some doing, and I think over the years I've learned to respect it much more than I used to. It's a bit more like being in the theatre than I imagined, but it is very much like rehearsing your movements, where you're going to be, how you're going to feel, and sort of blocking out all the negatives and just bringing the positives in.
Did you ever get nervous going on stage?
Well, I suspect I did, but I don't anymore. I kind of just take it in my stride. I did a private gig a couple of weeks ago, and I was nervous because it was a tent full of blokes, and I didn't know whether they were going to like me, so I was a bit nervous doing it. But in general terms, I'm very happy and excited.
And did you enjoy the limelight?
Yeah, I think I did. Whatever the limelight meant to me, I don't know, but it was an expression. It was, I suppose I walked with the swagger. It was a relief.
And then your next album after that was Sweets from a Stranger. And then in 1984, you split up. And why did that happen?
We just toured constantly for, I don't know how many years, and recorded for many, writing constantly. And it was just exhausting, and it was just time to stop.
Well, you actually didn't end up stopping that long, because then Jules asked you to do a charity gig, and then you were back and up and running again. And then you have Cozy Fan, Tutti Frutti, Babylon and On, where you have Hourglass, which is a hit in the UK and in the US. And the albums keep coming. And of course, it does sound, I mean, it's a huge triumph, huge success. It sounds effortless on the page, but obviously life isn't effortless, and it's not always fun-filled and not always sunny days. And I was wondering if you're comfortable, Chris, just talking about the addictions that you were suffering from at the time and how you brought yourself to your journey to rehab and that process.
For me, it was like being in a washing machine. I was just going round and round and round constantly, drinking, taking drugs, and being that guy in Squeeze and spending money and having a jolly old time, it seemed. But deep down, there was a lot of feelings that were kind of getting lost in it all, I guess. And Squeeze had, recorded all those albums which you're talking about now, right up to the Frank period. And then it just became like it was grinding to a halt. At least that's how it felt to me. It felt like it was just slowing down, and I needed to stop. I didn't know how to stop. And then one day I stopped, and a good friend shipped me off to rehab. The band were extremely supportive. I got lovely cards from everybody. And I've been in recovery now for 30 years. I've had a few dips, I have to say, but you can't not live without having the dips. They're important. I'm very grateful for that time, and I'm very grateful that everybody gave me the space to find a new horizon, I suppose.
How do you manage to stay on the right road?
Well, I don't really. I mean, I try and keep my life simple if I can, but the old brain is a tricky monster to deal with. So I'm grateful for all of the information that I've been given in recovery. It's got me in touch with a lot of things that I wouldn't have normally have got in touch with. I've got a lot of good sober friends, and hopefully I'll make the right decisions now. Some of them are very difficult to make, but that, they have to be made. So it's about living in the reality of the now, and how you process that, and how you process the disappointments, as well as the wonderful things that can happen and fall out of the sky. So I'm very lucky in that respect, but it's still a daily job to find out who I am, and it's not an easy one.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. In your book, you refer to the fact that you had dark moments when you were quite young. If I look at the teenagers who I see who have gone through a bit of turmoil, they tend to be the creative ones, the deep thinkers, the ones who sort of question. And I don't know whether that makes sense to you, if you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have spent a lot of time working with recovering addicts and alcoholics, going to prisons and rehab centres. And is that something you still do?
When the opportunity arises, yeah. The prison recovery thing is completely different than it was 15 years ago. It's changed a lot, but it's still a possibility. But yeah, I mean, I still keep in contact. I'm an ambassador for a couple of rehabs, and I work with different charities to help people through difficult times, if I can be there for those people. So I like to be able to mentor people that have been on a similar journey to me, just to share my experience for what it's worth. They may not listen, they may not take any advice, which I can't really fault them for. It's just to share your experience, really.
Yeah, well, I think more than anything, it's just to know that you're not alone. And Elton John, he mentored you. How did that come about?
I was in somebody's office and the phone went, and it was Elton, and he'd heard that I was in a sticky place, and reached out and said if I needed a hand to give him a call. So I did, and then we became friends.
Do you find it helps you to talk to others who are going through what you went through and obviously still are going through? Does that help you as well?
Yeah, it makes me feel grateful for my journey and where I've been, and I'm still lucky enough to be able to stand up straight and walk in a straight line. So, yeah, I mean, the whole point of recovery is to be able to share it with somebody, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of just being there, being in the room, or just being there and holding hands. It's like therapy within itself, really. You're talking to somebody, and then you realize that thing you're talking about is actually very pertinent to yourself.
Yeah. Well, going back to music, another thing that you do is you have these songwriter retreats, which you've been doing for just nearly a decade now. And Youngblood at Glastonbury, he came on stage with you this year. And I think that's how you guys met, because he went on one of your courses. It's such a different world now for musicians than going into Virgin and buying your vinyl. What advice do you give to these young songwriters and to young musicians in general?
It's different for everybody individually because everybody's got different views on what they want to try and achieve. But if somebody's willing and somebody has ambition and they're crafty with their work, then it's really not difficult to inspire them to just carry on with what they're trying to achieve, because ultimately whatever goal they're trying to reach will become a reality or not within a distance of time. So, but you have to go through that process to discover it for yourself. Like I was saying earlier, even after nearly 50 years in the industry, I'm still sort of struggling to reach that. So somebody who's just been in it for a couple of months, it's a long journey. It's possibly a lifetime's journey. And a lot of people don't get through it. A lot of people give up or they go and do other things. They discover it's not for them, and that's absolutely fine. I think if you're destined to be a good songwriter or destined to be the next Joni Mitchell, it will happen. And if it isn't, it won't.
Yeah. Well, then you also, on top of all of this other stuff that you're doing, you write your autobiography, Some Fantastic Place, My Life in and Out of Squeeze. And that came out in 2017. Brilliantly written, honest, self-deprecating, laugh out loud, and very poignant in places. How easy did you find that to write? Because that's very different from writing poetry.
I think I enjoyed the process of it because I had a really good vision of where I wanted it to be. I did make mistakes when I was writing it, which you can only see afterwards. But I think generally speaking, particularly when I reminisce about the early years, I think I definitely got that right when I look upon those early chapters of the book. I think when I start bringing other people into the book, I think that was folly, really. I think I should have just carried on focusing on self and what I was doing and how I felt, and not too much worry about who I was associated with or who I was working with, because I don't think I did myself any favors by branching out. But my publisher was very definitely in the mindset that I should do that because he thought that that would help sell the book.
Well, you were very honest about your relationships and very self-deprecating. So the title is Some Fantastic Place, and that comes from your album, and that comes from a song which was written about, I think it's Glenn's first girlfriend, Maxine, and who was very close to you, who tragically died. And she was pivotal in your life in lots of places, whether it was the fact that she was the one who picked up the advert and she was the one who said, you need to go and seek some help. And she's been a supporter. Who in your life, if you could pick 2 or 3 people, have really made your life so much more different because you know them?
Well, Maxine, very much so in those days. She was very instrumental in marrying Glenn and I together. And she was brilliant at giving us the space and the time to develop our songwriting. She was very generous, I have to say. Other people, I suppose, I'd have to include my wife, Louise, and my manager for a long while, David Enthoven, who has passed away as well, because he was a mentor of great altitude, and from above he could just give me a simple prod and make me feel good about myself or steer me in the right direction, particularly when I was having problems in my relationships within the band or with people that I was working with outside of the band. He would be right behind me. So I guess those are the three people that have been pivotal, and it's difficult when you're married and your partner is trying to be sensible, because ultimately, as a songwriter and as a musician, I'm not sensible. As a therapist once said to me, your head is in the clouds, but your feet are not on the ground. And you'd be such a great person if you could just get your feet on the ground. So women have a great understanding of depth of earth and what that is like, the reality of it. So I'm very grateful that I have that in my life, although I hate it at the same time.
Looking back now, with all the benefit of hindsight, just in terms of you internally, what would you most have wanted to change if you could go back and change something?
The only thing I think I would change is the book. Everything else remains as it was, and that's an incredible story within itself. I'm very grateful for the journey that I've been on, and it's not been easy because I've pushed against it for so many years. I find it very difficult sometimes to be in a band and to be on stage. It takes all of my might to accept it and enjoy it sometimes. Of all the things that I've recorded, records, songs, the book, I think is something that I think I could have made a much better meal of.
And when you were on stage, Chris, and it took all your might to be there, what was it specifically that you found the most difficult?
The commitment, I think, was always difficult for me. And I don't know what that was about. I think I always wanted to be in the bar rather than on stage, or I wanted to be somewhere else. I didn't want to be on the stage. It's different now. The last 15 years or so has been a gradual climb into self-acceptance and understanding of who I am. The time flies so quickly. In 12 years' time, I'm going to be 80 years old. So you think about 12 years ago, it's just like, that happened so quickly. So you kind of have to grab hold of it and just go with it, let go and let God, as they say.
Yeah. Well, and now you have a podcast as well. I never thought it would happen. And that's supporting the charity Help Musicians, which offers mentoring, mental health, training, funding for new projects and more. And what made you decide to do that?
During lockdown, I was sitting at my desk and somebody asked if I would be interested in helping the Help Musicians charity by running an online workshop, which I did. And then the next thing that happens, I'm doing a podcast, which I've always wanted to do. And we're just discussing series 3 now. I really enjoy it. I learn so much about songwriting and about me and about what it means to be in a band. All the people that I've interviewed, I have to say, have all had the same journey, one way or another. We've all got to where we've meant to be by doing exactly the same things, which is extremely strange.
You have all these amazing bands that are at the top of their game, like you guys, and then they fall apart, and then they regroup, and then they fall apart and they regroup. And I guess it's managing all those different emotions. Then you have the spotlight of the world on you as well. So there's all this pressure to maintain what you're doing. And to the rest of us, it seems we all want to be a rock star, but it's not as easy as it looks.
I think it's much harder now than ever before. And I think the industry has disappeared, for me anyway. And I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's something that doesn't pull me back. It doesn't push me forward either, I have to say. But, you just follow your instincts.
I didn't want to leave without talking to you about your imaginary friends who were there at the beginning of the book. And the reason I knew I was going to love the book was because you say only an addict would have 2 imaginary friends. And I had a whole family of them. So when I was growing up, and they were the Osmonds, and they would sit with me in the car, and I would get out of the car and I'd be chatting to them. And then my parents would shut the door and they'd say, no, the Osmonds are in the car. You have to let them out. But do you still have them?
They're a bit more distant than they used to be, but they're around.
My imaginary friends, they're not the Osmonds anymore, but I still have them. And I'm always a better person when I'm around them. I'm just that much funnier. And I'm the rock star when I'm around them.
Maybe they're in the garden. In fact, I can see one now.
And how do you find touring on your own with all the pressure that you've just sort of alluded to with Squeeze? Is touring on your own freeing?
I enjoy it incredibly. I love the freedom. I love the storytelling. Just enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. And I know you are touring with Squeeze this autumn, and you're going to be in London, I think, on the 19th of November. So I'm hoping to come to that one. And one of the last things you said was, that those twilight years need to be filled with ambition. And you're certainly busy. That is for sure. And it's a good lesson for me to take away. And in the meantime, I've just been the recipient of all these amazing songs. They've lit up my teenage 20s, 30s, 40s, now 50s. And, I never thought it would happen with The Girl from Clapham. And I never thought I was going to be lucky enough to talk to the man who wrote that lyric. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. God bless.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to Matthew Passy and all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.